If you're a professional brewer, you know how frustrating it can be when you go to place a yeast order and what you're looking for is out of stock. Well, Imperial Yeast is here to help by guaranteeing that commercial orders up to 20 liters of 10, yes, 10 of their most popular strains will ship free if they're not in stock when you place your order. Some of these strains include A38 Juice for those hazy IPAs, A07 Flagship, a classic in clean American styles, L13 Global, which is said to be one of the world's most popular lager strains, A44 Viking for your warm fermented beers, and so many more. So in addition to pitching right with the highest quality yeast on the market, they're promising that yeast will be ready when you need it or shipping is on them. Whether you're a pro or a home brewer, if you haven't tried Imperial Yeast in your brewery, it's time to up your game. You can check out everything Imperial Yeast has to offer and place your commercial orders at imperialyeast.com. Commercial brewers tend to produce anywhere from around 7 barrels or what happens to be about 200 gallons of beer per batch, all the way up to around 200 barrels or more, which is like 6,200 gallons of beer. Obviously, this is just a wee bit more than homebrewers can manage in their kitchens and garages. For whatever reason, though, the homebrewing industry has settled on 5 gallons or 19 liters as the standard batch size, but even this doesn't work for every homebrewer. You're listening to the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and this week I'm joined by contributor Martin Keene to chat about our experiences brewing different batch sizes, both more and less than the typical 5 gallons, which again is 19 liters. We're just going to call it 5 gallons henceforth.
Yeah, no, when I started really getting serious about brewing, I decided if I'm going to spend hours and hours making beer, I'm going to make like a good amount of it. So I went out and I bought a system for 10-gallon batches, and that's how I really got started with all grain brewing. And it was great because you brew it, I would share some with a friend, like I could give him a whole keg and I'd still have a keg left over.
That's right.
But then it's like, well, some of the beers weren't exactly the best, and now you've got 10 gallons of this stuff sitting around. So then I wanted to brew much smaller batches so I could brew more frequently and experiment, but all my equipment can only do the big batches. So yeah, that's what we're going to talk about today is going above the 5 and below the 5 gallons and all the sort of the impacts of doing that.
Absolutely. And there are reasons that you and I have brewed different batch sizes. We're going to get into all of that. Now, at the time I got my first brewing kit, everything in the store that I bought it from was set up for 5-gallon batches. There was really no other option, from the carboy sizes and the fermentation buckets to even the recipe kits. So I just sort of accepted that as standard and stuck to brewing that volume for, I think, the first 6 or 7 years of my brewing, career, as it were. It actually wasn't until I got into grad school here in Fresno that I brewed my first non-5-gallon batch, and unfortunately that was a Mr. Beer kit that a friend of mine got as a gift, and took us all of maybe 45 minutes to throw together. The beer that it produced absolutely sucked, as I think many people can relate with, but that experience did open my eyes to the idea that not every batch has to be the same size. I've also brewed many larger batches of beer like you, Martin, and I look forward to discussing all of those experiences with you today. All right, if you enjoy this show and you'd like us to keep producing it, please consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. I cannot impress upon our listeners how important Patreon is to us. By making a small monthly pledge, you'll receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. Coming up later this month, December of 2024, Brewlosophy's own Alex Shanks Abel will be hanging out with patrons and answering their questions. In addition to their role as a contributor to Brewlosophy, where they brew and write about experiments, the Hop Chronicles, Short and Shoddy, and all that other stuff, Alex has played an integral role in the Brew Lab, where they serve on the leadership team. Alex has also been a guest on the Brewlosophy Show with you, Martin, where they've talked about things like brewing like a cheapskate. This is going to be a fun session. If you've ever heard or watched Alex, you understand why. To be a part of it, be sure to make your pledge of just $3 or more by Saturday, December 28th, as Alex is going to be taking questions on Sunday, the 29th. All past sessions are stored on our private Patreon and Facebook pages, so patrons can go back and watch them whenever they like. Learn more about all of the rewards we offer for your support and become a patron today over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. Another really easy way to help us out is by using the links found at brewlosophy.com/support when you're shopping online. Your shopping experience doesn't change at all, and we get a tiny little kickback for the referral that really does help us to continue producing this content. Feedback this week is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who offer brewers various options for high-quality, reasonably priced electric brewing rigs in various voltages and sizes. I've used their 120-volt system for 5-gallon batches, as well as their 240-volt 10-gallon setup, and both are absolutely awesome. Clawhammer really puts the effort into ensuring their systems do exactly as they are intended to do and as efficient a way as possible. And if you're not ready to make the jump to electric just yet, they also sell 10 and 20-gallon brew-in-a-bag home brewing starter kits for very reasonable prices. Whatever it is you're looking for, do yourself a favor and visit clawhammersupply.com. We're confident you're going to love their stuff just as much as we do. Listener and patron Eric Pierce wrote in with a correction about an embarrassing mistake I made in our recent episode on brewing with oats. Eric said, I really enjoyed this episode and just wanted to point out that Grodziskie is brewed with mostly oak smoked wheat, not oats. My Polish ethnic background combined with being a fan of smoke-flavored beers makes this one of my favorite styles to brew, so I felt compelled to chime in on this. Still, oat and oak, you might actually be onto something. Time to throw some naked oats in the smoker and give it a try in my next Grodziskie brew. I do apologize to all of our listeners for making that mistake, and here's the thing. I actually know that Grodziskie is made with smoked wheat malt, so why I said it's made with oats in that episode is beyond me. We are currently in the middle of a move. The studio will be moving soon, not too far from where we're at now, but maybe just all of the stress from that got in the way. Either way, I own my mistake, and I'm grateful to listeners like Eric who point them out to me. Now, while I've never brewed a Grodziskie myself, I've had the opportunity to try a handful made by other people, and as far as smoked beers go, I'd say I enjoy it far more than Rauch beer, which isn't to say I love it by any means, but if you end up making one with smoked oats, Eric, I'd really like to try it out, so send it my way. What say you, Martin?
Yeah, I would also agree. The anything is better than Rauch beer, to be honest. It is a strange style, isn't it? But it actually, that kind of grew on me, the one that I did brew. But Marshall, I have to say, if this is classified as an embarrassing mistake, you have a long way to go, because I can, blow you out of the water with embarrassing mistakes. And anyone who watches the Brewlosophy show, watching me brew, there's normally one or two embarrassing mistakes every episode. Much bigger than that.
Well, and I'll tell you, our viewers are equally as keen on that as our, and no pun intended there, Martin, but as our listeners, in that they will let us know in the comment section when we made a mistake. We don't not like that. We appreciate it, and we will try to call ourselves out. I mean, we're only human. None of us fancies ourselves necessarily experts in any of this stuff. We just have a lot of experience in it. So we appreciate you calling me out, Eric. You know that that's the case. Eric is one of our patrons who joins us almost every single month for our live video chats, which is a reward that you get at the $10 level over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. So again, Eric, thank you. If you have show feedback or a correction for something that we said, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. Alrighty, time for a quick break. When we return, we'll be discussing our experiences brewing various batch sizes. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. When I made the switch from extract to all grain, I converted a 70-quart cooler, as many people did, into an MLT, a mash lauter ton, for batch sparging 5-gallon batches. And soon thereafter, I realized I could get away with making even more beer with pretty much no additional effort, just extra ingredients. And that time in my life, I was both drinking and sharing a lot more beer. So the idea of making more was quite appealing. Since then, I've brewed many larger batches, and by larger, I mean 10 to 15 gallons, using various approaches and methods that I trust is the case for you as well, Martin.
That's right. So when I really got into this and I set up my little home bar with taps and a keezer and whatnot, my initial thought was, this keezer is never going to be short of beer. I want to make sure I always have enough beer coming out of this thing. So I am going to brew 10-gallon batches. That way I know I will always have enough beer. If I brew once a month, I mean, it's just I'll be swimming in it. And my main reason for going to 10 gallons was actually because I would brew almost every batch with a buddy of mine. And that way, at the end of the brew day, we would just split the work in between two corny kegs, two 5-gallon kegs each, take it home and ferment it at home and take it from there. So it was kind of perfect. And there's a lot of good reasons for being able to do that, because you get so many sort of economies of scale. You're buying stuff more in bulk. You are having to spend sort of less time overall. If I had to brew two 5-gallon batches, it's going to take me a lot longer than one big batch as well. So I'm saving a lot of time. It just seemed really efficient and economical to go that way.
Yeah. Your reasonings for brewing larger batches are very, very similar to mine. When I moved into the house that we are now moving out of, 14 plus years ago, it was right around that time that I introduced a really good friend of mine, Chris, to brewing. And some could argue, or I would contend at least, that was the real genesis of brewlosophy. That was where the spark got lit, was that, you're brewing with two people, and for a good period of time there, it was like, all right, you can just come over and drink the beer at my house that we're brewing together. He lived a mile and a half away. But then it was like, well, he's like, I put in all this effort. I'm also contributing to, we would pay for, every other batch. So I'd buy one, he'd buy the next one and whatever. And we've actually even bought parts of our setup together. So it was this really shared brewing setup. Well, what we started doing was brewing larger batches so that he could come and take growlers and stuff home. He didn't have a kegerator at that time. He lived in an apartment, didn't have room for it, but it was cool to have that much more beer so that he could come over whenever he wanted. He had a code to my garage if I wasn't home, and he would just fill up growler after growler or bomber after bomber and take them with him wherever he wanted to go. So that was a big reason that I first started brewing larger than 5-gallon batches. And for the most part, it was 10-gallon batches. Other reasons, though, there was a period in time, surprising as it may sound to listeners of the show who know my opinions on competing nowadays, where I was submitting a lot of beers into competition. And to be able to have that much around didn't feel like I was brewing just for the competition, if that makes sense. I still had a whole keg basically for myself, and another keg that I could just spend all on competing. I could submit it in multiple events. I could have some around to save for if I needed to submit more, stuff like that. Did you ever use, that as your excuse for brewing more volume?
No, actually, I don't think I've ever entered a beer competition at all, ever once.
That's unique, Martin.
Well, with Brewlosophy, we get plenty of feedback on our beers as it is, so I don't feel like I need any more. But actually, brewing through Brewlosophy is one reason I still do brew 10-gallon batches. I brewed one this past month because when I'm doing an experiment, so with an experiment, typically we'll use two 5-gallon systems and brew them side by side, and there'll be one variable introduced. But if the variable is introduced post-boil, so in the fermenter, for example, I would rather do the brewing all in one big batch, because that way I know I'm using exactly the same wort going into the variable. So yeah, even today I'm still brewing these big 10-gallon batches just for Brewlosophy beers.
Yeah, absolutely. Same deal. That was a big part of it as well, is you're giving so much of it away. And usually, people see on the articles or the show, or you hear us talking about it on the podcast, that we're sharing, 5 to 6 ounces or so times 3 per participant. But, for me at least, I would invite people over to my house on a Saturday or a Sunday and serve them, the triangle test. And then when everybody was done, they're like, can we have more of that beer? And so we're all sitting around drinking the test beers now. So I needed to have more. There was a period of time, I haven't done this in a while, but where I was making not 2 5-gallon batches for experiments, but 2 10-gallon batches. And we'll talk about gear considerations here in a minute. But, that's 4 kegs of beer for a basic experiment. And that was enough to get me by while still having beer on tap for me to enjoy myself, right? Because I'm sharing so much. 20 to 30 people coming through my house and drinking on a Saturday afternoon. Beer goes pretty fast in that scenario. Another reason, and this is a fun one, I think, for that I decided to move into making, or why I guess I would start making these larger 10-gallon batches, was because I could split the batch and, make a standard, and I put that in air quotes, but like a standard batch fermented with, say, a Belgian yeast. But then the other half would get pitched with a bunch of dregs from sour beers or with a sour culture from a lab. And I would sour that one up. In fact, that's pretty much what I did with one of my first Flemish red ales that I ever made. Was a 10-gallon batch. 5 gallons got put into a carboy and placed in my sour shower, as it were, and left for over a year, whereas the other batch got hit with some Belgian yeast and we drank it 2 weeks later. So to me, it's like, oh, cool. You're putting in less work, pretty much same amount of effort as you would for a 5-gallon batch, but you're getting 2 completely different beers out of it.
Yeah, that's a really fun way to do it. I had this thought that when I started brewing beers for the Hop Chronicles series, that's always the same recipe. We have a standard recipe and the only thing that's different is the hops. So I was thinking like, maybe I could just like make 20 gallons of wort or something one afternoon and then freeze it and then thaw it out and boil it and add the hops then. I never did get around to doing that, but that would be kind of a fun one to try.
I think it would be a fun experiment before we started doing it for the Hop Chronicles. Let's see if freezing wort, I know that there's people they purchase wort from breweries in certain countries. I've heard about where it's like, or they buy fresh wort kits at their homebrew shop. I don't know if it's been frozen or not, but I think that's pre-hopped. It would be interesting to make the wort, freeze it, and then move on to boiling it with the hops and doing all of that. I mean, you still have to take up space in your freezer, so I'm not sure how economical or efficient that would be, Martin, but it is something. Another cool thing about larger batches, though, kind of along the same lines as the whole making sour beers as well as a clean beer, is if you're making a beer that is good for aging. So, I think of things like American Stout as being a good one that can take a little bit of oxidation or aging without getting bad. So if you want a fresh version and then one that you plan to have around for a while, or if you have a style of beer like barley wine that everybody loves, and I have a friend who makes an excellent barley wine that he calls night juice because it's very strong. Well, when there's only 5 gallons left, it's going to be around for another few months, but everybody who goes to his house wants a little sip of night juice before they leave. It's good to have a couple of kegs on, so you can make 2 of those, let those age while you're drinking your, the last keg of your first batch. And it's just a really nice way to ensure that you have that, beer ready when it's needed.
Oh, I can really relate to that. I brewed an Eisbock, and with an Eisbock, it's basically a doppelbock, and then you freeze distill it and get rid of all of the frozen water. So you're left with a much smaller batch than you started with, and then you age it. And a good one is aged for between sort of 3 to 5 years. That's when it starts to get into its prime. So I did that, and I have it still in my Keyser. I think it is hitting about 4 years at this point. And every year, the buddy who brewed it with me, we get together and we try this beer, and it's improving every year. And we are just kicking ourselves that we didn't do a bigger batch of that, because we'll never be able to catch up with that now. And it would take another 4 years to get where we are today. So yeah, I would so wish that some of these beers that I've aged, we went for bigger batch sizes just for that reason.
Well, and that brings us to our next consideration when it comes to making larger batch sizes, is that you have to have the equipment to do that. And we're not just talking about in order to brew it, but to store it as well. In order for you to have that beer around, for 5 years and not run out of it in 10 years, you'd have to have more kegs to store it in. And then you'd have to have a place to store those kegs. So these are things you have to keep in mind, obviously, when it comes to brewing larger batches. I also personally feel, at least in my experience, that storing my own ingredients in bulk made it a much more economical thing to brew larger batches, because buying a sack of grain, 55 pounds of grain for $45 is a much better deal than spending $2 a pound on grain. And so you're getting a much better deal out of it. Same with hops. If you're buying your hops in bulk from Yakima Valley Hops, you're going to get a better deal than and I'm not dissing homebrew shops. We need them. I get that, but you're going to get a better deal than if you're buying them by the ounce, from an online shop or even your local shop.
Yeah, and for that reason, I have 6 of these Vittles vaults in my basement. Each can store 55 pounds of grains. So that's a full sack. So I have those lying around, and a freezer full of hops as well. So when it does come time to brew one of these big batches, it's pretty easy. Everything's there on hand. And as you mentioned, economically, that's absolutely the cheapest way to do it.
Yeah. And then the other considerations when it comes to gear, of course, is just the size of your, whatever you're using for a mash tun, whatever you're boiling your wort in, your kettle, it may be the same vessel. For me, I started off brewing and put a pin in this. I started off with a 4-gallon, stainless steel kettle that I got at Walmart, I think. Heavy bottomed, clad type of kettle. I still have that kettle, in fact. And that was for extract with steeping grains. Well, from when I built my MLT, the converted cooler MLT, I also went out and got a much larger kettle. And for me, that was a 10-gallon kettle. Well, 10-gallon kettle does not make 10 gallons of beer, of wort, right? You can't safely boil 10 gallons of wort in 10 gallons of a 10-gallon kettle, because you're actually going to have more like 11 and a half to 12 gallons of wort, accounting for all of your losses. It just won't fit. So very soon after I built that MLT, I bought some much bigger 20-gallon kettles, and that was what allowed me to brew side by side 10-gallon batches, because obviously I'm a nerd and I did 2 identical setups. So that's something you got to consider as well. And then, further on down the line, your fermentation vessel, are you going to split that wort between 2 fermenters, or are you going to try to put it all in one larger vessel? I did buy a Spidell 60-liter fermentation vessel, and, as I'm wont to do, or not to do, I suppose, I didn't even consider the weight of that thing when there was, 11 gallons of wort in it, and it became an absolute bear. I'd have to call my neighbor over to help me pick it up and to put it into my fermentation chamber. So then now you're thinking about, okay, how am I going to get that wort over to the fermentation vessel in a way that doesn't rely on me lifting it up and breaking my back, right? I mean, these are things you have to keep in mind.
I mean, it seems obvious that if you're doubling the volume, that you're doubling the weight as well, but it's not until you actually experience it. I mean, when I brew my 10-gallon batches, I'm using a Clawhammer supply system. So they have a 20-gallon brew kettle. And yes, it holds double the amount of the 5-gallon, but everything just seems so ginormous when you're used to the 5-gallon side of things. So yeah, the kettle itself, the basket that goes in, which I would pull out by hand for 5 gallons. Well, once we're doing 10-gallon batches and you're trying to pull out the mash basket, doing it by hand is a very poor idea if you care about your back at all. So you need pulleys and whatnot to be able to pull the thing out. Then, as you mentioned, if you're fermenting it, if you're putting that into a single fermenter, well, you'd better make sure that you've got a way to be able to pump the wort into that, because you do not want to have to pick it up and move it, and to be able to do a clean transfer out of it for that same reason. So yeah, I've certainly found that once you go above 5 gallons, everything becomes much, much harder. You can't be moving that stuff around anywhere near as easily or by yourself. You're going to need some help.
Yeah, and these are just things that, I feel like through our experiences we've learned as we went through it. To me, I bought this Spidell, a beautiful fermentation vessel that I ended up selling this like 10 years ago, selling it to some winemaker, a local winemaker, because they're just pouring juice in by the box or whatever. And it was easier for them to wield. For me, it was not, because of my setup at the time. But these are things we've learned through experience. So hopefully some people get something out of this. We've already talked a little bit about aging, but a point that I wanted to make was if your favorite style is IPA and you're drinking a lot and you're sharing a lot, then you can absolutely, I know a lot of friends who do this. I did it for a long time. Make 10-gallon batches of, relatively time sensitive or age sensitive beers, as long as they're going to be consumed relatively quickly. If you're wanting to make big batches of stuff just to leave it around in your keezer for a long time, I mean, your mileage may vary, but for me, that was when I started noticing the signs of staling and oxidation in my hoppier beers. Not so much my like pale lagers and stuff like that. Those, we just blame it on lagering, right? Oh, they get better with time. But with hoppy beers, I would put a little bit of a caution asterisk on that, because of the fact that hop character is going to fall out. And if you didn't mind every little point of potential vector of oxidation, then it may very well be that second keg just isn't as good as the first one.
Totally. And, pick your styles carefully, I would say. When I was working my way through the Homebrew Challenge, there were a few beers that I really wanted to age a lot longer than I was able to, because just with the production of doing one a week, I had to get to a tasting normally within 2 months of brewing the thing. But I ended up keeping some of those kegs around. So I had an old ale, a Belgian quad, I think, and a couple of barley wines. And then I did keep them around and try them a year later, and they were so different. Now, subjective as to whether they were better or not. I thought in most cases they were significantly better than the original beers. So I was really pleased that I'd done that and that I had kept them. So yes, the beers will be around longer, but if it's a beer style that might benefit from that, then this is actually a huge plus.
Exactly. And if you go into it with some level of intention, to me at least, it allows you to take into account the fact that these beers are going to be aging. I made a barley wine one time. It was a 5-gallon batch, but about 3 weeks. In fact, I think it was the short and shoddy barley wine that is published on the website. The beer was good. Like 3 weeks after I brewed it, I was shocked that it wasn't hot and just this gross mess. It was real tasty. But then I left half that keg around for like 8 months, and Tim, the beer reviewer, came over, and I was like, dude, I forgot about this beer. Let's give it a shot. And it was phenomenally better, in my opinion, right? It had that time to kind of round out those sharp alcohol flavors. That maltiness really got emphasized. The hop character fell out, but the bitterness was still there. There's a lot of good that can come from doing that. So having bigger batches, again, allows you to not regret not making more at the time that you were brewing it, and for very little extra effort. And another consideration is cost. If you're buying in bulk and you double your grains, I mean, that is effectively $5 to $10 maybe additional for double the volume of beer in the end. Yeah, you're using more hops. If you make a starter with your yeast, you don't have to use 2 packs. You can find ways to make it an economical decision.
Or quite the opposite as well. When I first started out and I was brewing a lot of high gravity beers, Belgian Triple was really my favorite beer to brew. We'd go to the homebrew store and we'd get our 10-gallon batches of Belgian Triple and, look at the yeast calculators. It's like, well, you're going to need 4 packets of yeast and here's all of the other ingredients you need. And it would be $100 and something just for this one batch of beer. So it can get pretty expensive as well if you're buying all of that stuff at the store.
Yeah, and I don't make recommendations often, but if you're going to be as obsessed with this as we are and start making 10-gallon or 15-gallon batches or even more than that, look at your cost specs, because you're going to end up spending way more on and I get that hobbies are for blowing money, jobs are for making it, but it's kind of a bummer when, you make 10 gallons and maybe it's not ideally, where you wanted it to be. But you've got these 2 kegs of beer now that are sitting around and you spend $120 on it. You can very easily figure out ways to not spend that much on a 10-gallon batch of beer. I would just recommend you put the effort into kind of messing around with the numbers, because bulk is really the way to go if you're going to start getting into larger batch sizes like this. The only other consideration I have on my notes is brewing frequency. The larger or the larger volume that you brew, the more beer that you end up making, the less brewing ostensibly you're going to have to do. Now that is, of course, if you're not consuming massive amounts with you and your friends.
Yeah, and for me, this was one of the primary reasons for going to 10-gallon batches initially was we can just brew it a little bit less. This takes a very long time, so that'll be good. In the end, I kind of felt like I wanted to go in the complete opposite direction. Brewing less was a big minus because I wanted to try so many different things and processes and ingredients and recipes and so forth. So for me, in the end, that was not something that I was wanting to do. Less brewing, that's bad.
I want to brew more often. Yeah. I gave a lot of beer away when I was making those 10, 15 gallon batches. I'll tell you that. In fact, one of the reasons that I think I brewed 5 15-gallon batches of beer in my day. Most of the time they were for dual experiments, which talk about confusing, trying to keep that all separated. Oof. But a couple of times it was for events that friends of mine would ask me to brew for. So a friend of mine asked me to make some kegs for it was like some relative's wedding. I wasn't even at the wedding, but it was a relative of his that he promised he'd provide beer for and didn't have time. And he comes over, come on, man, you got your stuff set up. Can you do it for me? And I said, yes. And having the ability to do that in a 20-gallon kettle, I just thought was really cool. Again, you have to make considerations. So for me, whereas I typically brew no sparge, and we're going to get into methods for making these larger batches. So we'll start with no sparge. At the time, I was using that converted cooler to make 5 and 10-gallon batch, no sparge, batches of beer. And now for me, a full volume, no sparge, 10-gallon batch would have to be at about 1052 or lower, which is kind of my sweet spot. So that always worked out for me. Well, for a 15-gallon batch, of course, I'd have to turn that into a batch sparge which wasn't an issue at all. but I was capable of doing it because I had that 20-gallon kettle as well. If you're kind of married to the traditional fly sparge approach or continuous sparge where you're sprinkling water over the top, I've done it a couple of times, more or less a modified fly sparge in my opinion, but it's a lot of work for not much benefit in my opinion. So I haven't done it too often. Have you're using the claw hammer units, which are sort of, there's a little bit of a fly sparge type of feel to them.
Yeah, but two things I really don't like doing when I brew is, one is cleaning vessels, and two is attending to the mash. So I just like to put the grains in the water, turn on the recirculation pump, and walk away and come back an hour later. And that is why I am very much a no sparge guy, and do it all in one vessel. Yeah, that has been almost exclusively my experience, is just to do it all in a single vessel through recirculation.
So when you're doing that on a 20-gallon claw hammer unit, are you able to get away with, because I've not brewed a 10-gallon batch on the 20-gallon electric all-in-one system. To me, though, it would seem like you're going to have to do some sort of a sparge just to get your boil volume.
No, I don't at all. So it works exactly the same way as when you're brewing the 5-gallon batches in the 10-gallon kettle. So it's just recirculating through that spray nozzle at the top. I will tend to give the mash a bit more of a stir with the 10-gallon batches, just because there is such a large volume in there. But no, I'm not having to perform a sparge after that. I mean, you just let it operate for an hour and then drain it, pull the basket, and you're done.
That's perfect. And yeah, you mentioned basket. The claw hammer system is an all-in-one that relies on a basket as your lauter device. And so, it's very similar, in my opinion, to a bag that people use for brewing a bag, which I switched to, 7-8 years ago. Now, here's the thing. You think about removing the grains from the wort as opposed to removing the wort from the grains, which is the more traditional approach. In order to remove those grains, you have to have muscles to lift it out in one form or another. I have definitely done 10-gallon batches with brew in a bag, and it's not something that I would recommend unless you have a really good setup with like a pulley system and all of that. I had a small kind of rink-a-dink pulley that I would use, but even that with 10 gallons, it was just unwieldy. It was heavy. It was a pain. Now, my friend Tommy Caprellian from House of Pendragon, when he was starting up, when House of Pendragon was still in the nano phase, he went to, I believe it was a 3-barrel brew in a bag system. No joke. There are photos out there of him pulling out this huge brew in a bag with, hundreds of pounds, it had to have been, of spent grains. And it worked. He made fantastic beers doing that. So it is possible. I just think it makes things a little bit more difficult just because of the weight of that grain bag.
Yeah, well, congratulations to Tommy. That is insane because the weight of spent grains is just incredible. I mean, you know how much the grains weigh when you put them in, and when you come out, they are completely waterlogged and soaked, and I don't know how much heavier they are, but they are just so heavy, especially with these baskets, you pull them out and there's still a lot of wort in the basket and that's all draining out rapidly. But just the initial pull is so heavy. So yeah, with a 10-gallon batch, doing that manually for me is just absolutely no chance. So I did install, I'd had a little pulley, and I would be pulling with all of my weight on the rope to get this thing to come up, and it would look like it's going to fall back in at any point. Then
exactly.
I upgraded, right? So I upgraded to a nicer pulley, and now it's just got bigger gears, and you can give that a good tug, and it comes out. Even then, I still, once the basket has drained all of the wort out back into the kettle, I then have to pick that basket up with the spent grain still in it, and even then, that's still pretty heavy. So it's not to be underestimated how difficult it is to extract those grains out from that wort.
If you are a brew in a bag or brew in a basket brewer and you plan on making larger batch sizes with a pulley to remove that grain bag, whatever you do, know that whatever that pulley is attached to is secure, because you do not want that thing breaking or falling. I've seen, this hasn't happened in a while, but I saw some horrible photos online a few years ago of it was like a, I think it was on Homebrew Talk or something, but somebody had started one and people were like, oh my God, this happened to me too. And I'm just sitting there going, I feel like it's going to happen to me any day now, because I get scared every time I pull that pulley. So now let's say we talked a little bit about the different mash methods when it comes to making larger batches. For people who have, let's say, a 5-gallon setup and that's all they can, handle at that point, but they want more beer, it is always possible to just make 2 batches, combine those batches together, and now you've got 10 gallons of the same thing. You're still brewing 2 batches. It's not like you're brewing a larger batch. But another fun thing that you can do is what we call a party guile. And you're the Englishman here, Martin. What exactly is a party guile? Have you ever used this method?
I have, yeah. So basically, after the end of your brew day, you take those spent grains and then you perform a second mash to create a second beer. And this works best if you are starting with a pretty high gravity beer, and then the party guile will be a much lower gravity beer after that, because there's still a lot of sugars, still residual sugars on those grains. So you could get a beer maybe in the sort of the 1020 kind of 1030 OG range by going through that second batch. I did try this once, very unsuccessfully, and the beer it made was absolutely appalling. And I realized why when I went back and thought about it. Is I did a mash out step, which was basically to kill off all the enzymes that were still in that grain. I did that at the end of my first mash. So by the time I got to the party guile, there was basically very little alive still in there in terms of enzymes to be able to convert any of the starches to sugars. So it just didn't work out very well. But I have talked to some friends that have done this method and have actually tried some of their beers. And party guile is a really clever way to be able to get a second beer out of the same grain.
It's really cool. And I've not shared your experience. The few times that I've used this method have worked out swimmingly for me. And I've learned a few things about it, and I'll go over that. But, thus far, when we've talked about brewing larger batches, we're basically talking about making 10 gallons of the same beer. The beauty of party guile is that for very little additional effort, there are some gear considerations. It's probably best that you have 2 kettles, though not completely necessary. You can make 2 completely different beers out of the same mash. And one way to do that is by sprinkling in, some specialty grains for the guile for that second runnings. And really what you're doing, this confused me at first because I was thinking in terms of batch sparge, not full sparge. You're making 2 full sparge mashes out of the same grains, the same base grains, we'll say. And so, you put in whatever it is, 8.5 gallons, 9 gallons of water. You let it steep for your hour or however long you like to mash for. You run all of that off, you boil that wort, and that's your first batch. Then you add the same exact amount of water, maybe a little bit less because of absorption. You collect the same volume. It's a much lower OG. And then you can add different hops. You can throw in some steeping grains. You can do so much to make it just its own completely different beer. I love this method. I think it's a lot of fun, a really easy way to make more beer for very little work. The one lesson, the biggest lesson I should say that I've learned in my experiences using the party guile method: make a very high, relatively high OG beer first, so that there are still enough residual sugars in those grains to make a decent beer in the end. And by that, I just mean above 1030 OG or so. What I like to do is there's another little trick I've got that I'll hit on here in a second, but you make something like a double IPA, and then you can, that wort is perfect for a pale ale. You can add chocolate malt even and make that wort into a porter or something. You have a lot of options. You can also reserve some of that high OG wort to the side. And this is the way, I believe this is the way, one of the big, I don't know if it's one of the big English breweries, I believe, does it this way, but they actually do 3, or they have 3 different beers that they make from a single mash. You got your high strength, you've got your low strength, but then they blend some of the wort from both of those to make this medium strength beer. I've done that as well, and it works insanely well if you do it right. You just got to be cognizant of the strength of that wort from that, from your first mash. Yeah,
that's right. So you're ending up with a pretty high gravity beer and then a pretty low gravity beer. I hadn't really thought of actually keeping some of the high gravity wort and then adding it in to the second batch after you've mashed it. That's kind of clever. That would make a lot of sense. I do want to revisit this. This is making me want to brew another Party Gal because mine was such a miserable failure, and I've heard so many people talk so positively about this. and just if you do one of these high gravity beers, and then you kind of just try some of the spent grain after the end of the mash, it is still very sweet. So there's plenty of sugars on there still.
Without a doubt. To me, it's just an awesome way to get, like I said, to get two completely different beers, if you want it to be, out of basically the same mash. Now, in a similar vein, you've got the option of dilution, which a lot of people poo-poo. It's like, oh, that's such a bad thing. That's what, the big beer makers in America do. It works really well as long as your water's good. Let's say you only have the ability to make 5-gallon batches in your mash tun, but you can boil, or you're cool with storing it for an hour, half of it for an hour. Make a really, really strong OG wort, and then go through and boil that, do your thing, add all your hops, and then you can split it between two fermenters, half and half, and then top both off with water, and you've got 10 gallons of the same beer. Or you ferment 3/4. Do one with 3/4 of wort and 1/4 water, and the other one has 1/4 of, 1/4 of wort, 3/4 water. You got two different beers again. There's a lot of options when it comes to utilizing the efficiency, I guess, of brewing to make more beer easily, I suppose.
Yeah, and that, of course, gets around some of the problems that you might otherwise have, which is you don't have big enough equipment to do this. You're concerned about the weight of all of these ingredients and pulling out the grains and so forth. If you are doing the dilution at the end, you're keeping all of that stuff down until you're into the fermentation stage. So it's a nice way to get around some of the things that would otherwise be prohibitive to brewing 10-gallon batches.
Yeah, without a doubt. And when it comes to dilution, just to get it out there, you can also dilute the wort pre-boil if you're into that. If you're concerned about, contamination in the water that you're topping off with, absolutely. If you have a couple of kettles, or if you're gonna set some wort aside, you can boil in the same kettle iteratively. I mean, that's totally fine as well. We've done all of this. I've tried all of the methods that we've talked about. And we all have experiences that aren't perfect, but they all work. So it's to me, it's a neat way to make more beer very easily. So we got to cut to a quick break here. When we come back, we're going to be shifting our focus to our experiences brewing smaller batches of beer. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. Chilling wort can be a chore, especially after a long brew day, but not with the exGEERitor Counterflow Chiller, which can chill a 5-gallon or 19-liter batch of wort in 5 minutes or less, leading to a strong cold break and clear wort in the fermenter. Brewlosophy's Matt Del Fiacco uses the exGEERitor Max and absolutely loves it. In addition to improved chilling efficiency, every exGEERitor comes with a 5-year warranty that covers the entire chiller for manufacturer defects. If you're looking to up your chilling game and a CFC is right for you, head over to exGEERitor.com today. For the first, 10 years of my brewing experience, 5-gallon batches seemed to be viewed by most people as sort of the baseline from which to grow from. All of my friends I had who brewed beer were constantly looking for ways to make more beer, not less. It actually wasn't until Brewlosophy was around for a year or two that I brewed my first smaller batch size, and there was a specific reason I did that. Martin, I know you have probably much more experience than I do brewing smaller batches as well. What were your reasons for reducing your batch sizes?
Well, it started off that when I was brewing these 10-gallon batches, it was fun, but it's also such a commitment to the beer that you've brewed, because now you've got 10 gallons of this stuff to give away. So sometimes it was wonderful. I brewed a really great Belgian triple, a really nice English bitter, and it was so sad when those kegs kicked. But there were other styles. Like I did this really funky saison, and I thought it was going to be good, and it was like drinkable, I guess. But when you look at, you pick up the keg and it's still almost full, and then there's a whole other untouched keg sitting right next to it with the same beer in it. It made me wish that I had sometimes, with the more experimental styles, gone with smaller batches. So that was my initial reason for wanting to go smaller. Then once I got into the Homebrew Challenge, I was brewing a different beer every week for 99 weeks. And I started out brewing 10-gallon batches on the Homebrew Challenge. And
Jesus.
realized that was going to be a problem. I got down to 5-gallon batches, and that was still a problem because every week there was a new batch of beer ready to go. So I ended up switching it to 2.5-gallon batches. And for most of the beers for the rest of the challenge, they were just 2.5-gallon batches. And that way, that's still enough to be able to sort of try the beer. And you still have 20 pints or something from that. So it's enough to share it with other people as well. But not so much that I couldn't have a free keg for the next beer ready to go, or that I would get sick of the beer. So that was my reason for doing it. It was just frequency of brewing.
Yeah. So at the time that the Brewlosophy got started, not only was homebrewing in this just rapid, incline in popularity, it was awesome. And I cannot wait till we get back to those times. But all of my friends were beer drinkers at the time for the most part. And so it was very easy for me to blow a 5-gallon keg in 3 or 4 days, over a weekend. So me brewing a lot worked out in everyone's favor because they got free beer, we got our data, and I had beer on tap, for whenever I came home from work or to drink on the weekends watching football. So that was excellent. The problem became as I started doing more and more for Brewlosophy, and I'm thinking about what can I do that most brewers would shy away from because, well, it's just stupid, right? Like in their minds. And I got the bright idea one summer day. And for those who have never been to Fresno in the summer, our average temperature is like 108 degrees Fahrenheit. Very, very warm. But I got the idea during a brew day to steal some of the remnant wort, put it in, just some marginally sanitized pitcher and set it under a bush in my front yard for a couple of hours. And so I did that. And then I came back and grabbed it a couple hours later, covered it up, and I let it sit out for a few days. And sure enough, fermentation was happening. And I was able to measure that to prove that it was fermentation, at the very least, because of measuring the specific gravity. So I got that all done. I'm thinking, okay, what are the odds I captured something good? Probably pretty low, but I've got to make a beer with this. Do I want to pitch this potentially nasty gunk into a 5-gallon batch of beer and waste all my time doing that? No. So what I did, it was the very first time I ever made a 1-gallon batch of wort, and it was a lot of fun. I was able to do it on my stovetop in my house while watching a football game, or whatever it was, sport was on TV at that time, baseball I think it was. But I just thought it was so cool to be able to do that inside in my old 4-gallon kettle that I bought, for my first batch of beer that I ever made. Brew in a bag, again, 1 gallon. You're looking at 1.5, 2 gallons total of water that you need with the grains in there. It's light. You can pick it up, take it out, squeeze it, put it on a strainer type of deal. It was really cool. The beer turned out absolutely awful. It was one of the worst things I've ever put in my mouth, to be honest. I guarantee you it was more than just wild yeast that was in this, the culture that I ended up getting from my bush, for better or for worse. But it was fun, and I'm really glad I didn't have 5 gallons of it. So for me, one of the big impetuses for me, moving into smaller batch brewing, or for relying on that approach, I suppose, is experimentation.
Yeah, exactly. And I felt when I was doing 10-gallon batches that I really didn't want to experiment too much. I would stick to published recipes and so forth, because it's just, I'm going to spend quite a lot of money on the ingredients and then the time, and then I've got to do something with this beer. But once you start going down to much smaller batch sizes, it's absolutely an opportunity to just try stuff out. Yeah, I mean, that's quite an extreme example there, Marshall, and I love it. I mean, you would never want to do that with a big batch, but even less extreme than that, just trying a new ingredient or just tweaking percentages in a recipe of maybe I should just add 15% of this specialty malt instead of 10% and see what I get from that. It gives you the opportunity to really do that and play with it without having to worry too much about what am I going to do with all this beer afterwards.
Absolutely. And that goes for, maybe you don't want to pitch nasty microbes into a batch of wort that you produced, but let's say you're working on developing a recipe, like a house recipe, right? I never really got into that. I usually would just make a batch of some weird recipe I designed, and if it was good, I'd brew it again. But I know I have friends who really wanted to work on, like, this is going to be the brown ale that I serve at my house and have on tap all the time. I'm going to work on it over and over and over. And so they would brew 1 to 2.5 gallon batches, iterative batches, right? Making subtle changes here and there until they landed on the recipe that hit all the marks for them. To me, that's just such a great way to do it, because not only if it doesn't turn out how you want it, do you not have much to consume, but you're going to be brewing much more often, and you have more opportunities to make those tweaks while the memory of the prior batch, right, is still in your head. And to me, that's just it's actually what a lot of commercial brewers do. They've got their pilot systems, right? That's exactly what we're talking about here, is like a 1 gallon to 3 gallon pilot system to make, to develop these recipes of yours.
Yeah, that's right. It's the pilot system for a home brewer, right? So if we think of our regular commercial brewer as the 5 gallon batch, and then these pilot systems are just brewing, a gallon or two, trying things out, seeing what it does, moving on, experimenting on to the next one. Absolutely.
Yeah, and it's a great way to do that. It's also a lot of fun because, again, it doesn't require all of the gear that you need for bigger batches. Usually, you have all of the stuff on hand. You can easily make a batch of beer without going to the homebrew shop if it's going to be a 1 gallon batch. Now, I say that sort of tongue in cheek. Most people have the gear they need to make a 1 gallon batch. Obviously, you need ingredients and such. Another reason that people might want to opt for, this sounds crazy to you and me, Martin, but might want to opt for smaller batch sizes is the amount that they consume just isn't that high, right? So they can't drink a full 5 gallons before it stales or goes bad. And so they make a smaller amount so that it stays fresh. And they're, they might take the same amount of time to drink a 2 gallon batch as we do to drink a 5 gallon batch, but it stays fresher in that time. And I think that's a smart way to do it. I got an email from someone a couple of years ago who was like, how are all of you guys brewing these 5 gallon batches of beer and getting rid of them so fast? I make 2 gallon batches and have it for a month. And you guys are talking about having a 5 gallon keg gone in 2 weeks or so. Well, my response to him was, we give most of our beer away, but I know people who are, they're blowing through beer a lot faster than others. So
when I was doing the homebrew challenge, the number one question I would get is, what are you doing with all of this beer? I would give this away to anybody. I mean, literally, we had like electricians come in to do some work, and they would leave with a growler of beer, whether they wanted it or not, because I just got to get rid of this stuff and I don't want to just dump it. Neighbors, friends, anybody would receive this beer. It actually became a bit of a burden just to try and get rid of it. Every time I brewed the beer, I was like, right, who am I going to be able to palm this off on? Which I never thought that would be the case. When I got into brewing, I thought, I'm just going to be the cool kid in school now. I've got free beer to offer people, and this will be wonderful. But yeah, you brew too much and it actually becomes a burden as to how am I going to get rid of all this stuff?
Can relate, my friend, can relate. When it comes to gear considerations, we've already talked a little bit about this, but really, I'd say if you're going for like a 2 gallon batch or less, a 4 gallon pot is wonderful. It can be aluminum. It can be Analon. It can, as long as you have a pot that boils water, you're good to go. You don't want boilovers, especially if you're doing it on your kitchen stove. It's kind of a mess. Your partner's probably not going to be too happy with you. So be mindful of that. The other issue that I ran into when I've done, back when I was doing extract with steeping grains, as well as the few times that I've brewed smaller batches on my kitchen stove, most of the small batches I've made have been with my normal brewing equipment. We'll get to that, but is the condensation. And so, you can turn your hood fan on to pull that stuff out, but now, there's going to be some element of stickiness. I know that ideally it's just water vapor, but I found that it does, some of the stickiness does kind of go up and muck up the filter there. So just keep that in mind if you're doing that. But yeah, the gear considerations, you're going to get away with brewing a 2 gallon batch, usually with stuff you got in your kitchen. I think that's pretty cool. And like we mentioned before, whereas brewing larger batches is going to cost you more, brewing smaller batches ingredient wise is going to cost you about half as much. So
yeah, you mentioning this, I'm just thinking about when I did used to brew on the kitchen stove, and that air filter, how sticky that used to get. Oh, so bad. But But yeah, when you are brewing those smaller batches, it sort of opens up other methods to you. Like for chilling, for example, I was just taking my pot off the stove and then I would put it into my kitchen sink, which was filled with icy water, and then I'd just give it a stir. And that was my chilling method. Now, I could never do that with a 5-gallon kettle or a 10-gallon kettle. So it just sort of opens up different ways to be able to do things. Adding oxygen as well, super easy. I could just splash it around and give it a stir. Things become a lot easier when you're going at those smaller scales, and they sort of open up more ways that you can get those jobs done.
Yeah, it just feels more manageable, which I'm sure everyone listening understands. That when you've got 2 gallons of wort versus 12, there's just something about it that's like, this is easy, and let's fingers crossed. It turns out one thing you got to keep in mind is yeast. The most expensive part of any batch of beer, I think. Now, there are ways to make it much less expensive if you're harvesting and reusing yeast. In this case, one of the things that I played around with long ago, this before Brewlosophy, was making a small, friends would come over, we'd split wort, stuff like that. So I'm left with like 3 gallons of wort that we split from a 6-gallon batch or whatever. And I'm thinking, well, it doesn't need all of this yeast. So I would like split a pouch of dry yeast, and it worked perfectly fine. It doesn't need the whole thing. Now, people will say you're better off over pitching than under pitching. I get that. But in my experience, it was a way to kind of prolong the use of a single pouch of yeast.
Yeah. Now, I have a freezer full of little frozen yeast vials. And the reason I have that is because when I switched to doing 2.5-gallon batches, I would pour 2/3 of the yeast packet into my wort, and then I would go through my little process to freeze the rest of it. So I had all these different yeast strains in my freezer, which I could pull out at any point, defrost, and go through the process to bring them back to life. So that was a nice little benefit, that I was essentially getting to build a yeast bank without having to actually purchase any additional yeast, because the wort I was using didn't need all of the yeast that was in that packet.
Yeah. And shameless plug, we have a great video on the Brewlosophy show about Martin's process for freezing and preserving and reusing yeast. So go check that out as well. We talked a bit about the methods for brewing larger batches of beer, and how that would apply to the different mash methods, fly sparge, all of that. When it comes to making smaller batches, you can use any of those methods that you want. But usually if you're making a smaller batch, something you got to keep in mind, if I'm making a 1-gallon batch in a 20-gallon kettle, that's going to be different than if I'm doing it in a 4-gallon kettle on my stovetop, right? And so sometimes it just won't work. Your immersion chiller usually takes about 1.5 gallons for the bottom coils to even have some impact on chilling that wort. You don't really need to use that. So to me, the best approach, or the most, I guess, efficient approach to making smaller batches is brew in a bag, because it's the spent grains are light enough that anybody, my 11-year-old daughter could lift it out of the kettle. It's cheap, and you don't usually 4-gallon kettles don't have, valves on the bottom and all of that stuff. It's just basic. And so that's what I would recommend if anybody is opting to make, 1 to 3 gallon batches of beer, is just you get a small kettle and a bag, and you can ferment in pretty much anything. I have a friend who makes 1-gallon batches and ferments them in apple juice bottles that he converted the lids to have airlocks, and it works great. So,
yeah, my experience has been to use the existing brewing equipment that I had and just halve the size of the batch and to see what the impact of that was. Now, when I first started doing that on my 10-gallon system, that was a Blickman Brew Easy. And in order to brew 5-gallon batches, it has a sparge arm. It's called an auto sparge, and it just sort of stays at the level of the liquid. Well, when there's only half the liquid in there, the arm couldn't actually reach down low enough. So right. You could buy a longer sparge arm. So you would actually have to buy another piece of equipment. Very inexpensive, but you had to buy something else in order to be able to work with those batch sizes. Now, with the clawhammer system, that's designed for brewing 5-gallon batches, and I wanted to see what is the minimum amount of beer I could actually brew in that system. And there are really 2 considerations. One is when you put the grain basket in, the grain basket sits on some feet so that it's above the heating element. So that needs to be submerged. Otherwise, you're not going to have much of a mash. And then the second part is once you get to the boil, how low down can you get before the heating element is exposed to the air? Because if it's exposed to the air, that's going to be bad. You will hear it before you see it, and then you will smell it because you'll get this burnt smell. So that has to be avoided as well. And it turns out with the claw hammer system, the heating element sits it's covered at about 1.5 gallons. So I'm thinking, well, let's go 2 for safety. So I think the minimum I could brew on a 10-gallon claw hammer system, which is designed for 5-gallon batches, is about 2 gallons. So that's still a pretty small batch. I was a little bit concerned that when you are doing that, the kettle's a bit wider than you'd want it to be for that size of batch. So as the water passes through the nozzle and then goes through the mash bed is super thin because it's really spread out in that basket. And would that have problems with efficiency and so forth? And I didn't really find that to be an issue as long as I was remembering to stir the mash bed. So when you're looking to do small batches and use your existing equipment, the first thing to really figure out is like, what's the smallest you can get away with? And then what would you need to modify to do that? I looked at all sorts of other ways of trying to brew even less. Like, what if I put in there, like, I don't know, something just to take up space in the bottom of the kettle so that the liquid level would be a bit higher. Something sanitary that I could put in there. I was thinking of maybe putting in a ton of these sort of whiskey cubes into that. And that would just sort of eat up some volume. So it would bring the liquid level up. Mm-hmm. So there might be ways you can go even lower than that amount of beer, but that just seemed like a lot of work. So I didn't get that far. But yeah, that's been my experience is taking systems and then going at least to half what they recommend as the intended batch size and going from there.
Yeah, that's the same approach I take when I'm making smaller batches on my 10-gallon electric setup as well. Is the lowest I'll go is half of a 5-gallon batch, which again, that's 2.5 gallons, but really, with my brew house efficiency and all of that, it's the boiled wort is probably like 3.25 gallons, and then I'm leaving about 1/4 to half a gallon behind, and I'm fermenting, 2.5 gallons or whatever it is. So, but those are things you got to keep in mind before you just go out and say, I'm going to make a 1-gallon batch on my 20-gallon brewing setup. Also, not for nothing, if you take 1 gallon of wort and you put it in a 20-gallon kettle and light your flame underneath it and boil that, it's gonna evaporate a lot faster than if you were to do that in a much smaller kettle where the height of that volume is just deeper. The wort is deeper. So that's just another thing to keep in mind. Now we've spent, I was talking a little bit earlier about how my friend would come over and we'd brew like a 6-gallon batch, and we'd both end up with 2.5 to 3 gallons of wort. We'd ferment them differently, and then we'd compare them later. That was usually, a lot of that was done before Brewlosophy was around, just a way to kind of experiment and have some fun. But it does, kind of speak to the fact that even if you want to make, you got your regular 5-gallon setup, you want to make a 5-gallon batch, but get different beers out of it. In the same way that we were talking about with larger batch sizes, you could brew a 5-gallon batch, split it between, I don't know, 5 different carboy or, smaller carboys or buckets. The little 2-gallon paint buckets work beautifully for this, by the way. And they're like $4 a pop, at Lowe's. And you could ferment it with different yeasts and experiment that way. Or you can split a 5-gallon batch between 2 fermentation vessels and do something different, maybe add some steeping grains to the one batch and get a completely different beer out of it. So now you've got these 2 ostensibly smaller batches from a single 5-gallon batch, which I think is pretty neat.
Yeah, that's right. It really does allow you to experiment. And yeah, so we're talking about pretty tiny batch sizes if you split it across 4 or 5 different fermentation vessels. But why not? I mean, that just gives you a chance to really try some very different things and see what you think. And it is surprising. I mean, I'm always amazed by this. That when you do take the same wort that had the same hops, the whole shebang, but you add different yeast in, how different those beers can be.
Oh yeah. Yeah, and I want to plug a good friend of ours, Basic Brewing. James and Steve over there, I feel like are kind of the godfathers of small batch brewing. They were talking about it long before we were messing around, or I was messing around with it. Before Brewlosophy was even a thing, they had kind of developed this really neat way of testing hops out and such. And one of the things that they do at Basic Brewing Radio, by the way, is a wonderful podcast. If you're not listening, you should go subscribe right now. They didn't pay me to say that, I promise. But one of the things that James was doing relatively frequently was either, like we discussed earlier, just making 1 to 2 gallon batches all grain with brew in a bag, or just buying dry malt extract, adding the palest dry malt extract he could get to some water, boiling that for 15 or 20 minutes, adding hops, and you'd have a nice, really basic pale ale that you could use as kind of a hop comparison type of thing or a hop test type of deal. I've done it before. I'm not the biggest fan of brewing with extract for various reasons. I do think that there's a specific extract flavor. I'm not saying it's bad. I just don't think it's for me, but also it's messy. And since I've got grain, it's a lot cheaper to just use that than it is to use malt extract. But it's a really fun way to quickly hammer out a batch or two, that's a smaller volume so that you can test some stuff out. Have you done anything like that, Martin?
Well, yeah, you're reminding me of my extract days here. And yeah, you're talking about messy. So you've got two choices with the malt extract, the liquid and dry. So I started off with these liquid malt extract packs, which is, just super gooey, and you pour them in and it can never quite get it all out of the container and it just drips everywhere. So I was like, right, screw this. I'm going to DME. This is nice, clean, dry powder. Well, that powder gets everywhere as well.
It floats everywhere.
It floats everywhere because it's so light. It floats everywhere. And also, as you start to pour it into to the hot water, just the condensation from the water ends up clumping the DME. So then you have those sort of issues as well. With the LME as well, it would always go on, when I was using a heating element, it would get on the heating element and often scorch, or I'd be concerned it was going to do that. I just think that the whole all grain process is so much easier, and you do not have to spend on a whole hour mashing, especially for these small batches. You can get away with a much shorter mash than that. I'd much rather just do that, but this is totally a valid option as well, and it is a very easy way to be able to quickly produce some wort that you could use for your beer.
Yeah, a couple of things. We spend a lot of our time talking about all grain brewing, and there's a few reasons. One is that that's what we do. And I think most of us enjoy all grain brewing more than using extract. We feel like we have more of a hand in it, but we are not minimizing, extract brewing. I don't mean to come across that way. I know that there are people out there who just don't have the space for an all grain setup. I would argue that you do, and we can help you with that. But I understand that drive to not want to jump into something that feels more convoluted. When it comes to using extract, the first, I think, 12 batches that I brewed, you had to use liquid malt extract. That was the good stuff, the high quality stuff. That dry malt was crappy. It was cheaper, and just don't use that. Use a liquid. I fully disagree with that these days. I have used fresh liquid malt extract next to fresh dry malt extract, and the dry malt extract tastes better every single time. I don't know what it is about LME, but to me, the homebrew flavor that a lot of people used to complain about was usually a function. It tasted to me like liquid malt extract. So my big recommendation, do whatever you want, of course. I'm not saying that one's more right than the other, but get some dry malt extract. It's usually cheaper. It's really easy to use, at least easier than the liquid stuff. And to me, it ends up tasting better. You can also get away with making a much paler wort because liquid malt extract, for what the process in making it, results in a slightly darker wort, even if you're using pale LME. So just some things to keep in mind.
Yeah, and my first brews were all the same liquid malt extract kits, and they used to sit on the homebrew shelves, I think, for like years at a time. So they probably weren't that fresh. And when you talk about that sort of that homebrew twang, I can absolutely taste that same thing in the back of my throat right now, just from remembering how that tasted. And I know at the time I was still very happy that I'd made beer and this kind of tastes like beer. But once I'd sort of moved away from the LME to try other things, it's like this tastes like the beer I'm getting at my brewery. Like,
exactly.
They got rid of that problem entirely.
Yeah. And that really is the key. We should do a Brews Views episode sometime on malt extract, because I have a lot of opinions about it that I'm not one of those people who thinks that just because I hold the opinion, everyone else should. So I've been hesitant to talk about certain things like this, but it's true that a lot of what I think, people complain about homebrew, it has to do with mostly contamination and the use of LME. That's just my opinion. We'll save that for another episode. But another neat thing that you can get away with, whether you're using extract or all grain on a small scale, is you can make, let's say you don't have the ability to store or use or purchase bigger gear, but you want 5 gallons. Again, make a really strong, initial batch of wort and then dilute that. I just think that's such a cool way to get more beer out of a single, mash or I guess boil if you're using extract. So all kinds of fun options there. I'm sure we didn't cover everything, but that is all the time that we've got for this episode. If there's a way that you're brewing different batch sizes, and by different, we just mean not 5 gallons or 19 liters, that we didn't hit on, we'd love to hear it from you. You can shoot us feedback at feedback@brewlosophy.com. Martin, do you have any final words on your experiences brewing different batch sizes before we wrap this up?
Well, we've covered it all, haven't we? We've gone from the big giant batch sizes, back-breaking batch sizes through to the little ones as well. But the important thing is no matter what the batch size, we're still making beer.
Amen to that, brother. And keep making beer. Keep sending us beer because we love to drink it and talk about it on the show as well. Don't forget to check out our YouTube channel, The Brewlosophy Show, where Martin covers a bunch of awesome topics in the world of brewing and beer. And remember to head over to brewlosophy.com to stay current on everything we're up to. The Brewlosophy Podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy Podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman.